Okay, AP scholars, so I'm going to go through quickly just the first two essays that you'll see in the packet for the Muckraker prompt sample student work. So as you can see, I've gone ahead and crossed off the old scoring prompts, old scoring of the old prompts. You can go ahead and skip, again, skipping this page, so the first two pages, and we're going to start here with A. I know this one might be a little bit harder to read because of the handwriting. I've read it a couple of times now, so I'm hoping I don't mess it up either, but there's definitely a chance that I will, so just kind of bear with me. Okay, so when Teddy Roosevelt coined the term muckrakers, he intended for it to be an insult. However, some, such as journalist Jessica Mitford, were delighted to adopt the name for themselves. Muckrakers are journalists who search out and publicly exposes real or apparent misconduct of a prominent individual or business. So just so far, all we have is just kind of like restating the prompt itself, not necessarily giving us any new information. You can do this if you wanted to restate the quotation, but you don't have to. Then we get into the thesis. Although in some instances, journalists can take their stories too far, when the information is accurate and relevant, muckrakers can have a very positive influence on our society. So here we have a thesis. And this is what kind of thesis? This is a qualify thesis. Yes, I hope you all just said qualify out loud. Notice in her thesis, or his thesis, or whoever wrote this, they are very specific about when they do think muckraking is a good thing and when they think it's a bad thing. So when the information is accurate and relevant, it is a good thing. But when they take their stories too far, then it's a bad thing, okay? Okay, so now we're going to continue on to the first body paragraph. Okay, so Teddy Roosevelt coined the phrase muckrakers to describe journalists who had used propaganda to generate strong feelings and instigate the Spanish-American War. So this right here is kind of like evidence a little bit, instigating the Spanish-American War. And notice that that's a pretty specific point in time that they're talking about here, right? When Teddy Roosevelt was president. That's an example of a historical event that relates to muckraking. If you did not know that's where the term came from, that's not a big deal. But what I will say is, and some of you kind of maybe questioned this a little bit actually in your brainstorming, was this is possibly one way to look at earning a point for sophistication by sort of acknowledging the broader context / like implications of the argument, right? Back then, being a muckraker was definitely a bad thing. The war was largely considered unnecessary, but the muckrakers, or yellow journalists, had stirred up American sentiment in support of the war. At that point, there was nothing for the country to do but go to war. In this case, the journalists had gone too far, since much of what they were writing was exaggerated. Also, and here's one that several of you also brought up, so I'm doing evidence kind of in green. Well, sophistication, let's do sophistication in green. I'll do evidence in yellow. I'll circle it. Many gossip columns and magazines are also called muckrakers in a negative sense. Oftentimes, a simple fight between two married people will be blown out of proportion, and gossip magazines will report these two people will be getting a divorce or that their marriage is on the rocks. In such instances, muckraking is not a positive term. So here we're bringing it back to the thesis. Okay, so again, connecting both of these ideas back to the overarching sort of controlling thesis statement. One way they could have improved this section is by giving specific names of these like married people. So some of you mentioned like specific celebrities who had struggled with the media. That's one way to do it right here. Okay, so continuing on to the next body paragraph. Here we get sort of the opposite view, right? So if up here we had when they are negative, right? They're controlling the country, they're getting us into unnecessary wars. When muckraking is used correctly, however, the benefit to readers outweighs the negative effects of the reporting. Okay, so we're talking about the benefits to readers specifically. One of the most obvious examples of positive muckraking is the Watergate scandal. One or two of you actually thought of this scandal but couldn't remember the name for it. This is a really, really good example. When the journalist announced the truth about the deception the president was committing, Americans were more informed and were grateful that they had accurate information. So that's our number one, right? Talking about how they had accurate information. Walter Cronkite's visit to Vietnam Some of you alluded to something very similar, if not this exact example, but like the role of reporters in going to war and kind of reporting back what's actually happening is another example of positive muckraking. Throughout Vietnam, Johnson, who was the president at the time, that's what this word says is Johnson, assured the American people that things were going well in Vietnam and Americans were beating the communist forces. Walter Cronkite had doubts about this verdict, however, so he went to Vietnam himself. He reported that the war was actually at a standstill and nothing was being accomplished. While the effect of Cronkite's visit to Vietnam was not positive for President Johnson, the American people were more informed about the truth of Vietnam. So just to recap so far, we've had 2 examples in each body paragraph. So we had 2 here. So keep in mind that you want to try to come up with multiple examples. Now this paragraph, I'm actually not necessarily going to go through too much. This one, they kind of revisit the idea of crossing boundaries, but defining what makes boundaries appropriate to cross. So when is this good and when is it bad? I think that this is a great paragraph, but I don't really think it adds a ton necessarily. I think you could maybe argue that it adds a bit of sophistication because it does sort of just like elaborate even further on the complexities of their idea, but it's not necessary. So I'm not going to go through all of it, which brings us then to their conclusion. Muckraking was originally intended as an insult. Muckraking now represents the purpose of journalism. Discovering and exposing the truth for the people leads to a more informed, thankful society. So here's where we have kind of a summary of the main ideas. Okay, so to sort of sum up the scoring for this one, the thesis, obviously they get a 1 out of 1. They have one, it's very clear, they maintain it throughout. For evidence and commentary, they get full credit. So they get a 4 out of 4 for that. They have lots of evidence, they very thoroughly explain it, and every single thing is connected back to the prompt. And then for sophistication, now, do they have evidence of some sophistication? Yes, but I would argue that it is not necessarily as prevalent throughout as it should be to receive the full point. So the AP graders would probably give them a 0 for 1. I think they are very close, but they're not quite there just yet. Okay, so moving on to our next essay, we have essay B. So for this one, this is technically, like I said, considered a passing essay. This person would have gotten maybe a 3 on the AP exam, but if I'm grading this, I do not necessarily think this is a great example of a, quote, passing essay. But it does start off much stronger than it actually ends. So I'm just going to kind of quickly go through this one as well. So what does one think about when they hear the word muckraker? I think of a person who is given the dirty job of picking up an animal's muck. This person is already committing the cardinal sin for Miss Wheeler, which is using the word I. Do not say I think, I would not. It is just so unnecessary. Okay? I would not want to do that, but a muckraker is also someone, a journalist, a news reporter, etc., who turns up dirt on a certain company or person. That doesn't sound glamorous either. So for their thesis statement, you remember you don't necessarily have to have it in your intro. And we're not really sure at this point, is their thesis that being a muckraker is a bad thing? It seems that way, but it's not super clear at this point. So for now, we really don't necessarily have a thesis statement. Okay, so moving on to our first body paragraph. Many muckrakers today go deep into their stories and sometimes exaggerate to make the topic seem worse than it really is. So this sometimes exaggerate seems like being a muckraker is a bad thing. I believe that it is not necessary to be necessarily good, again, don't do this, good to be called a muckraker, but I also believe that there are times when it is necessary to tell the world of a certain misconduct. So all of a sudden, we are now getting their actual thesis statement. And for whatever reason, it's in its own paragraph. So we do have a thesis, but it is very kind of weirdly structured. Okay, so now moving on to our real first body paragraph. John D. Rockefeller did a lot to make himself rich that he caused many other people to lose their jobs, money, homes, and dignity. He didn't care about anybody else, and his secretary, Ida Tarbell, so one or two of you actually brought up Ida, and I'm impressed that you know who she is. And if you Googled her, if you do Google her, she's a pretty well-known muckraker. Knew this. She kept an eye on him and kept track of everything that Rockefeller was doing. After he died, Tarbell wrote a book which included all of the ways that Rockefeller took to make his fortune. Tarbell's book caused the world to really look at the late Rockefeller and analyze his actions. The government made all of Rockefeller's actions illegal, and thanks to Ida Tarbell's muckraking skills, the world knows the man that Rockefeller was. So here we sort of have only one example, right? But we do have a reason that muckraking is a good thing. So there's not really much of a transition between the thesis, which seems to imply that muckraking is not great, and then the positives of muckraking, but it's something. With Ida Tarbell as an example, muckraking can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. It can also have negative side effects too. What if there were suspicious acts going on in a certain industry and I decided to look into it? Okay, sounds fine. So what is wrong with this? All right, this is the opposite of sophistication, okay? This is very informal and it's very just like not, doesn't really make you sound like you're writing at the college level. And now we're getting into a hypothetical. What if there were? And remember, you can use these, but they really don't strengthen your writing very much. Let's say that I had a bias against the said company and I really wanted to sink. So again, let's say, this is a hypothetical, and I really wanted to sink down to the bottom of the food chain. I would pull as much dirt over them as I could possibly find from this one little possibly irrelevant lead. I could take the suspicious act, say a storage container, filled with unmarked boxes, and say that the boxes were filled with illegal substances that were imported from some foreign country. Okay, well, maybe that was, again, too informal. But that is what muckrakers do. So this is, again, the sort of the negative sides of muckraking, but this is not a very good example, right? Because it's not actually real. It doesn't actually happen. In conclusion, muckraking isn't completely bad, but it isn't the best either. People or companies could be looked into because of something someone said. It can possibly help society, but can also destroy it. So for our final scoring, the thesis, yes, there is one. It took them a minute to get there, but they do eventually get to the point where they have a thesis statement, which, is fine. For the evidence and commentary. Evidence and commentary, remember that they have to go together. They're the same category. So for this one, we're going to give them a 2 out of 4 because they do not really have great evidence throughout. They have that one that's like, oh, hey, Ida Tarbell, she's great, but then the other one, not so much. And then finally, for sophistication, hopefully you've picked up on the fact that this person does not get credit for sophistication. So really, truly, yes, this is a person who would have earned a 3 predictably, but this is a very weak 3. This person would have had to really done well on all of the other essays and probably have killed the multiple choice section. Obviously, we're not taking the exam quite like that now, but this is a very low performing passing essay. And they're really only saved by that beginning part where they kind of have that good example of Ida Tarbell. Okay, so please let me know if you have any questions. I miss you guys.